If anyone is hearing this recording right now, do not go into Blackwood Forest in Montana. If you see the old tower standing among the trees, run as far as you can, because whatever lives there is neither human nor animal. The autumn of 2014 was unnaturally cold, even for northern Montana, and the dense forest near the abandoned Blackwood National Park had been considered cursed by locals for many years. A U.S. Army squad was carrying out a secret operation near the old park territory where intelligence suggested a group of weapons smugglers might be hiding. Sergeant Daniel Harper walked ahead of his squad, carefully staring into the darkness between the trees, while cold rain hammered against his helmet and blurred his vision. The storm arrived so suddenly that within minutes the sky turned nearly black and the violent wind bent the trees as if something enormous were pushing them from all sides. Radio communication began failing little by little. At first, Daniel could still hear fragments of his teammates' voices mixed with static, but only minutes later there was nothing left except dead silence inside his headset. He kept trying to contact the squad leader, repeating his coordinates and position, yet only answer was the endless hiss of interference. The thick fog reduced visibility almost to zero, and very quickly Daniel realized he had completely lost his sense of direction inside the endless forest. He wandered through the wet wilderness for more than 2 hours, trying to find at least some sign of his men or a route back to the extraction point. But every tree looked exactly the same, as if the forest itself was changing on purpose to confuse anyone who entered it. His GPS had stopped working, the compass spun wildly in different directions, and the old paper map had become so soaked that the ink started dissolving in his hands. The air smelled of wet earth, rust, and something rotten, as though the carcass of a huge dead animal was decaying nearby. As darkness slowly approached, Daniel suddenly noticed something massive standing between the trees. At first, he thought it was part of a cliff or an old water tower, but when lightning flashed across the sky for a brief second, he realized it was an abandoned fire watch tower. The structure rose dozens of meters above the forest, and its rusted metal frame looked as though it could collapse at any moment. The top disappeared into the thick fog, while the entire tower creaked in the wind so horribly that it sounded like something was moving inside it. Daniel felt a brief moment of relief because height could save his life. If he climbed to the top, he might see a road, smoke, a river, or at least signal a search team. As he approached the tower, he noticed strange scratches carved into the metal supports, along with words cut deeply into the rusted steel. The largest message was written in crooked letters: "Don't look into the forest after sunset." Beneath it were dozens of names, some of them crossed out, and near one of them someone had carved a final sentence: "It comes when it gets dark." Daniel tried convincing himself it was only an old local legend or the work of teenagers who used to come there for fun. Ignoring the growing fear in his chest, he slowly began climbing the wet metal stairs. Every step echoed through the silence of the forest so loudly that the sound carried far into the darkness. And the higher he climbed, the stronger the feeling became that something below was watching him. Daniel kept climbing higher, gripping the wet metal rails with hands already stiff from the cold, while the tower swayed harder with every gust of wind. Below him, the forest looked like a black ocean slowly moving in the darkness, and the rain had almost completely stopped. In its place came a thick fog that swallowed every sound around him. When Daniel glanced downward for a moment, it felt as though the forest had somehow moved closer, as if the trees themselves had crept toward the base of the tower, even though that should have been impossible. He had reached about halfway up the structure when he suddenly heard a strange metallic sound somewhere below. It was not the wind, nor the creaking of the old tower. The sound was rhythmic, slow, and disturbingly similar to footsteps. It sounded as though someone else had started climbing the stairs directly behind him. Daniel froze and pointed his flashlight downward, but the beam disappeared into the heavy fog between the metal beams. He could see nothing except darkness and rainwater dripping from the rusted stairs. For several seconds, everything became silent, and Daniel tried convincing himself that exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. But then the sound came again. A slow, metallic creak echoed from below, much closer this time, and now he could clearly hear something heavy touching the stairs beneath him. His heartbeat became so violent that he could barely hear the wind anymore. He shouted into the darkness, demanding to know who was there, but the only response was a strange, rasping breath that lasted a few seconds before suddenly stopping. In that moment, Daniel felt true fear for the first time. Not the fear of combat or gunfire, but a deep, primitive terror that froze his entire body. He began climbing faster, barely watching where he stepped, because the only thing he wanted was to get as far away as possible from whatever was following him. The tower groaned louder with every movement, and the wind shook the entire structure so violently that the metal beams sounded almost alive. The observation platform was only a few meters away when suddenly his right foot broke through one of the steps. The metal stair snapped apart with a deafening crack. Everything happened within a second. Daniel lost his balance and fell, smashing against the rusted framework of the tower. His rifle tore free from its strap and disappeared into the darkness below, while he himself remained hanging in the air only because part of his gear became caught on a metal beam. The violent jerk made something snap painfully in his shoulder, but the worst pain came a second later. His right leg bent at a horrifying angle. Daniel screamed so loudly that the sound echoed throughout the entire forest. A jagged piece of white bone pushed through the torn fabric of his combat pants, while hot blood streamed down the metal stairs below him. The pain was unbearable. His vision blurred, nausea twisted his stomach, and his hands trembled so badly he could barely hold on to the structure. He tried pulling himself upward, but the moment he moved his broken leg, the pain exploded through his body so violently that he nearly blacked out. Beneath him, there was only endless darkness. And then he heard something far worse than his own scream. Someone was laughing, quietly, harshly, inhumanly. Daniel slowly lowered the flashlight toward the ground, and the beam revealed something standing beneath the tower. It was tall and impossibly thin. The creature remained almost motionless, but its arms were far too long and its legs bent backward like those of a giant spider. Its face was hidden in darkness, yet Daniel clearly saw the thing slowly tilt its head to one side, as if studying him. And then the creature began climbing upward. The creature moved across the tower with unnatural speed, even though its long, twisted limbs bent as if every bone inside them had been broken dozens of times. The metal stairs groaned loudly beneath its weight, yet the thing itself barely made a sound, except for a wet, rasping breath that grew closer and closer. Daniel hung above the darkness, barely holding himself up with blood-covered hands against the freezing beams, and for the first time in his entire military career, he realized he might die here, not from a bullet, not in war, but inside this cursed forest where nobody would ever even recover his body. In panic, he reached for the pistol strapped to his belt. His hands shook so violently that he could barely aim downward. The flashlight beam slid across the rusted metal, revealing only pieces of the creature at a time. Impossibly long fingers, pale gray skin soaked with rain, and arms far too long for any human body. When the light finally moved higher, Daniel caught a glimpse of its face for a single second and instantly wished he had not. There were no eyes, no nose, only smooth, pale skin stretched tightly across an elongated skull, while a massive black mouth split across its face almost from ear to ear. The creature was smiling. Daniel fired. The gunshot exploded through the night forest, and the bullet struck the creature directly in the shoulder. But instead of screaming in pain, the thing merely twitched and suddenly froze. Then it began laughing. The sound was so horrifying that cold sweat rushed down Daniel's spine. It sounded partly human, yet there was something animal inside it too, as though several voices were laughing at the same time. Then the creature lunged upward. Daniel fired wildly until the pistol clicked empty. Bullets slammed into the tower, sending sparks into the darkness, but the creature moved too quickly. Within seconds, it was almost on top of him. Its long arms wrapped around the metal beams directly beneath Daniel, and the rotten smell pouring from its mouth was so strong it nearly made him vomit. In desperation, Daniel pulled out his knife and began cutting the strap holding his gear in place. The metal hook kept him suspended over the abyss, but it also made him an easy target. The moment the strap snapped, Daniel crashed onto a narrow maintenance platform several meters lower. The impact sent an explosion of pain through his broken leg, and he screamed so loudly that his voice cracked. The creature instantly stopped moving. For several seconds, it simply stood higher up on the stairs, staring down at him with its faceless head. Then it slowly tilted its neck sideways, almost as if listening to his breathing. Daniel tried dragging himself backward, but the platform was far too narrow, and behind him there was nothing except open air and the endless dark forest below. That was when he began hearing other sounds in the darkness surrounding the tower. At first there was only one, then another, then dozens more. Metallic creaking echoed not just from below anymore, but from every direction around the forest, as though something enormous was moving through the trees. Daniel slowly turned his flashlight towards the woods, and his heart nearly stopped. Shapes were standing between the trees. Dozens of tall, thin figures remained completely motionless in the darkness. They all looked almost identical, swaying back and forth like shadows moving with the wind. Then, one of the creatures beneath the tower whispered softly in a voice that sounded almost human, "You belong to us now." The night felt endless, and Daniel no longer understood how long he had been trapped on the narrow metal platform in the middle of the cursed tower. The rain had stopped hours ago, yet the cold had only become worse. His uniform was soaked with blood. His broken leg had swelled badly, he could barely feel it anymore, and thirst burned through his throat as if he had not had water for days. The creatures never attacked him. They simply stood below among the trees, silently watching him. Sometimes, one of them would slowly climb partway up the tower, stopping only a few meters away from him, before crawling back down again. It was almost as though they were waiting, as though they already knew he had nowhere left to escape. Around 3 in the morning, Daniel started hearing voices. At first, he thought his radio had somehow begun working again, but the voices were inside his head. He heard members of his squad calling his name, heard the voice of his mother who had died 10 years earlier, and even heard children laughing somewhere around the darkness around him. Every minute became harder to endure. The fog surrounding the tower seemed alive, moving slowly through the trees, and sometimes Daniel thought he could see human faces staring at him from deep within the forest. Then one of the creatures climbed back up toward him. It stopped directly in front of him on the stairs, gripping the metal beams with its long arms. This time, Daniel could not look away from its face. The creature's black mouth slowly opened wider than any human jaw possibly could, and from the darkness inside came a voice. "We have waited for you for a very long time." The voice sounded male, female, and childlike all at once, echoing from every direction around him. Daniel wanted to scream, but his body refused to move. The creature slowly reached out one of its long, pale hands and pressed its cold fingers against his forehead. At that exact moment, the world around him exploded into visions. Daniel saw flashes of memories that did not belong to him. Endless tunnels beneath the earth, human bones tangled among tree roots, and dozens of people who had once climbed this tower and never returned. He saw the creatures standing silently among the forest decades earlier, waiting in the darkness while humans unknowingly came to them one after another. Then everything suddenly went black. Daniel woke up the next day to the sound of helicopter blades. A military search helicopter was circling above the forest. Rescue soldiers found him barely conscious on the platform of the abandoned tower. He was dehydrated, starving, filthy, and half dead from blood loss. The medics immediately treated his injuries and prepared him for evacuation. But one of the rescuers later admitted he would never forget the look in Daniel's eyes that morning. Daniel sat there silently, staring deep into the forest, as though he could still see something moving between the trees. The official report later stated that Sergeant Daniel Harper survived after becoming lost during a severe storm and suffering critical injuries from a fall inside a damaged fire watch tower. The Blackwood area was permanently closed to civilians, and the tower itself was demolished by military engineers several weeks later. But after returning home, Daniel was no longer the same man. Inside the military hospital, he barely spoke to anyone and refused to look people in the eyes. Nurses reported that he often woke up in the middle of the night whispering into the darkness of his empty room. Orderlies sometimes noticed him standing motionless beside the window for hours, silently staring at the trees outside the hospital grounds. 3 months later, Daniel disappeared. His hospital room was completely empty, and scratched into the glass window were only 4 words: "We are not alone anymore."